Good morning! We're very excited to talk about our future products today. First order of business, we are renaming the iPhone to the EU phone as to better appeal to our local governments. We're excited to announce that every component going into the EU phone is replaceable and recyclable and completely made of plastic water bottles. Due to new regulations, we have now eliminated wireless charging because of its inefficiencies of power, and now all of the cables that ship with the EU phone, including the new charge brick, have to be made completely out of hemp. The EU has also mandated that you may no longer use your smartphones at over 300 nits because that amount of brightness is just too big a strain on our crippling grid. On top of all of this, we're also very excited to announce that we no longer can ask for money for these phones. Instead, the EU will be raising taxes on its citizens and paying us directly through that income tax. Therefore, everybody will get an EU phone absolutely free of charge. And all I have to say about all of these changes is that I really wish we didn't have to abide by all these laws. You're not staying on script, Tim! Keep going! I'm sorry, all of the decisions you guys make just has so much logic, and I think this is gonna be a real win for the consumer. That's right, stick to what's on the teleprompter. Thank you for joining us today. Goodbye. I guess the EU didn't feel like they had enough control over the iPhone because there's now legislation, which we still got some time before it's officially enforced. It's still like 4 years out, but now they want to ensure that all smartphones have easily replaceable batteries for consumers. Now, the trouble I take with that law is kind of how vague the terminology is at this point, but I get the feeling that if they're trying to pass a bill about it, then they likely aren't happy with the current state of batteries in a lot of smartphones. I don't know if they want to push it back to, LG G5 days where all batteries could just be accessed. Basically, as long as you had a decent fingernail, you could pull the back off of a phone and just yank the battery out and put a new one in. I'm not completely against the simplicity and ease of that process, but definitely some downsides I've already seen people bring up in our Discord is like, well, if you make it too easy to remove the battery life, then smartphone theft becomes a lot easier because as soon as you take the phone, if you don't want it to be part of the Find My network anymore, you can just pop that battery out real quick and disassemble it and sell it for parts or whatever, in which case, I guess that's why Apple's being so strict about what parts are genuine and what parts are not. But also, it's important to keep in mind that as you enforce simplicity of battery replacements, that can start to eat into other features. I think part of the reason battery replacements are a bit more complicated, obviously, a lot of you guys have done that kind of repair. You know that if you follow Apple's step-by-step guide, it's not the hardest process in the world. You detach some screws, you have a heat gun. But if the EU decides that having to deal with all of these MagSafe coils and having to use a heat gun and alcohol wipes and all these fancy screwdrivers and stuff, if that all gets too much, then Apple may have to compromise or shift the design of the iPhone quite a bit just to accommodate for what the EU decides as easily replaceable. And I think this is going to start to become a growing problem that Apple is already facing in Asia with production, foreign governments basically telling them what they have to do, and Apple losing more and more control of these markets they want to be a part of. So I think this discussion has absolutely upticked the idea of Apple trying to either put their foot down and say, we're gonna pull out of the EU if these laws get too strict. But Apple ultimately is a company that mostly cares about money, so even if it compromises on the product, it means that, well, to make it replaceable or repairable, we had to shrink down on the battery size, or MagSafe can't be as good as we want it to be, or we can't necessarily figure out a way to make the back easy to remove when the camera bumps are taking up more and more space, so that compromises on the camera performance of the phone. Yeah, this is the type of government intervention I'm not necessarily a fan of. It'd be kind of one thing if they were just like, it has to be easily repairable by the manufacturer. So like, you can take your iPhone to an Apple store and the employees there, maybe the EU says you have to replace that battery if it gets below a certain percentage for free or for a heavily reduced price. But that's another part of this bill, right, is to make sure that there's not a bunch of batteries going to waste least, this bill is saying that you need to be able to bring back old batteries of any brand or manufacturer basically to any retail location, and they have to recycle it. Which there's definitely some big wins there for the environment, but to me, like, the switching from Lightning to USB-C, that's not going to damage or hurt the capability of the iPhone. In my opinion, that actually unlocks a lot of use cases and features that I really want the iPhone to have. And the same thing with like side loading on the App Store. You know, it's a software change that could complicate iOS further or make it more prone to malware or scams or having multiple app stores that confuse people, but ultimately it's all just software things, and there's probably a good responsible way they can allow side loading. But when it comes to, okay, now you have to design the entire back of the iPhone differently, or the battery has to be re-engineered from the inside, and that could result in battery life getting worse, camera quality not being as good because you have to designate more of the phone to something that is easy to pop off and replace, or of course, water resistance could take a big hit, or the likelihood of someone disconnecting the battery for the Find My network, that's when I start to get a little bit frustrated and say, yeah, this is not the direction I want Apple to go in. But ultimately, I don't think it matters what I think because, you know, I'm not an EU citizen. What I decide is a good or bad idea isn't going to affect what they do, but it certainly makes me wonder if in the future, to abide by local laws, Apple might start designing iPhones quite a bit differently for the EU market. You know, I thought it was a little bit crazy for Apple to just switch to USB-C on the EU iPhone, but if these types of rules start going into effect, then I could see them designing the backs and the batteries of the iPhone very differently just for that market. That way they can still retain better battery life or better cameras or better water resistance in the US market. Do you guys think Apple would design hardware that drastically differently for different regions? Or do you think Apple would consider pulling out of the EU entirely? Do you think the EU would even care if Apple tried to threaten that? All your thoughts and ideas, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. And thank you to everyone supporting this channel directly on Tailosive Tech Pro. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I'll see you all in the next one.